Hey everybody, welcome back to Appify Your Business. I received a comment from Sufi in the comment sections in one of my previous videos asking if I could demonstrate how you would create an application that allows you to capture transactions from a customer and then invoice them on a monthly basis. This video is going to cover how you can do that and show you how you can create a system that allows you for easy use to first capture the customer itself, select a list of units from a drop-down list, enter the quantities for that and the associated date of that transaction, and save that. And then on the monthly basis, generate invoices for specific months and for specific customers in your application, and automatically send invoices so the customer can receive an invoice email with an attached invoice with relevant information about their invoice and also the associated transactions with that invoice itself. So to get started, we'll jump into our table as usual, and you'll notice that I've set up 4 different tables for this application. First one's transactions. This is where we'll customize the different aspects of the transaction, such as having a unique ID for the transaction, who the customer is associated with that transaction, the unit that they purchased, the quantity that they purchased, and then the date that occurred. And then for the future parts of this app, what invoice that transaction has been associated with. And then we have the Invoices tab. This is where we'll keep track of the different invoices, which will have multiple transactions in that invoice. And you can see we have different columns to describe that. More importantly, this has been designed as a monthly invoicing app. So we're going to capture the month and the year and the customer, and that will be a unique aspect to each invoice. And then also the total value and the status of the invoice, such as whether that invoice has been pending payment or has been paid. And then we're going to have a table that describes our customers, mainly emails, phone number, address, and then maybe their preferred payment method. And then lastly, we have the units table, which very simply is going to house information about the units that can be in a transaction, such as the unit name itself, the cost with that unit, and then an image associated with that unit itself. And then I went ahead and pre-populated this units table with some items, just so it will help us have some context as we develop this application. So let's start with the transaction table, and we'll create an app from this table. So now that we're in the AppSheet editor, I'm going to go ahead and add the tables, the additional tables. All right, with the tables added, we're going to start first with our main table where we're going to be capturing the transactions from the user itself. So we're going to jump over to the column section and expand the transactions table here. For the transaction ID, we're going to verify that we have a unique ID being generated for the initial value. So whenever new record's created, there's an identifier associated with that. Then for customer, we're going to have a reference to the customer's table to store that. So we're going to build a reference to the customer. For unit, we're going to build the unit as a reference to the units table, so we can populate the unit, selected unit there. For quantity, that'll be number, integer. And then date, we'll have the date. And then for date, we also want to make sure that we set an initial value there for today. And AppSheet already did that for us. So with that transaction set up, then we'll move into the next table here. And that's going to be the invoices table. And this is where we're going to generate the monthly invoices for the user itself. So once again, we have the invoice ID. There's a unique ID set up for that. And then there is a month that has been assigned. We don't want this to be a date. We want this to be a number, because the way we track months in AppSheet is on a 1 to 12 basis. And then just for added validity, additional validity, we're going to set a minimum value as 1 and then a maximum value of 12 to make sure we don't exceed those bounds. And then for year, we're going to choose a number as well. And then we'll set a minimum value of 2,000. And then for customer, we're going to build that as a reference to the customer's table. And then total, we want this total value to be a price. And then lastly, there's status. To keep things simple, we're just going to use enum list called pending payment and paid. After that, we're going to jump into the customers table, make sure that these columns have been characterized accordingly. So we have email, phone number, address, and payment method, which for payment method, we can just have as a simple drop-down list here called credit card, cash, or crypto. And then there's also the units table. For units table, we want the unit to be text, and that'll be the key as a unique identifier. And then the cost will be the price, and then the image will be we will do an image field. Then I'm going to hit save. There's an error that showed up here in that I missed that AppSheet had set initial value for these month and year columns. And then what we're going to do is replace that initial value, not with the date, but with the month number and then today. So we're capturing the month number from AppSheet. And then for year, we will do the same thing. Instead of just having today, we're going to say year. So that way we're extracting the current year from whenever the invoice is being created. Then I'll hit save. So with that, we've did a rough characterization of the tables in AppSheet. And now what we can do is start to test out the structure we've put together initially. So here I have the transactions view that was originally set up. And I could go ahead and start to hit the plus button to enter a form here. And then you notice we don't have a customer yet, so we'll go ahead and work through that workflow and then save. So now that the customer exists in there, we could then add unit to this transaction. So say the customer bought a computer case, he bought 2 of them, and then the date's already pre-populated, and then the invoice. So right away, as we're filling out this form, we notice a couple things we don't really need to capture. We don't need this transaction ID to show up as a field, and we don't need the invoice to show up as a field, because we're not going to capture this from the user or the input itself. We're going to, these are going to be captured automatically, so we can go ahead and remove those. So I'm going to go open up the transactions table here, and then under transaction ID, I'm going to click the flash next to show, and I'm going to set the context to where view type is not equal to form, because I don't want this to show up under a form itself. I want this to only show up in views when I'm viewing the transaction identifier. And then for invoice, we're going to do the same thing and hide that also in the form view. With that said, now I have a transaction where I can easily select the customer and the unit that they purchased along with the quantity and hit save. And then we save that record. And this kind of leads into the next part of the app development. Now we start to see how this view looks as we start to build out and add records to the table. And we can see here that there's not a lot of information so far. So I'm going to go ahead and click this transaction link down here to open up the view itself. And for the purposes of this app, we're not going to make it fancy. You could obviously experiment around with the different views available. And click that link at the top right corner for more information on how to use views in AppSheet. But we're just use a deck view to keep it simple in this app. And then for the primary header, we're going to choose the unit. And then for the secondary header, we'll choose quantity. It'd be nice if we had a couple other things in this view, such as maybe the image of the unit that was purchased, and also the total cost of that for that specific line item. To do this, we're going to create some virtual columns in our transactions table to help pull over this data accordingly. So I'm going to add a new virtual column. First one we're going to pull in is the image itself of the item. We'll just call this item image. And because we already established the reference, we can say that the item image is the unit.image, meaning that it's going to go look in the unit table and pull the image field from that table. Next, we're going to add a virtual column here to calculate cost per item. And once again, we'll use a dereference where we reference the unit table and the cost of that item. And then lastly, we want to calculate the total cost of that transaction line item. So we'll call total cost, and then we'll go cost per item times quantity. With those three created, item image, cost per item, and total cost, we'll go ahead and hit save. And now that we've added these virtual columns to the app, We could then see the image associated with that view that we pulled in. And then we can also add other information, such as we could add the total cost here in the summary column. You can play around with this cost. Another tweak might be that instead of just quantity 5 showing generically, we might want to go into the transaction table too and add another virtual column here that can communicate more information on that single line other than just the number 5. So we could just call this item and cost line item. And what we can do is concatenate first the quantity of that item. We can add on an @ sign, and then we can add in the cost per item. So now in that line, when we go ahead and save it and add that view to the new second line, we have a little bit more descriptive, meaning 5 items at $100. We'll make sure we wrap this in text so that we can show the $sign. So we have this view fairly well set up. There's obviously there's some additional things that we can accomplish here. If we wanted to remove these actions for temporarily, we can. We can just turn that off. Or if we wanted to identify specific actions to be associated with that, we can do that as well. But really, I would advise everyone, as you develop these apps, try to keep things as simple as possible first so you don't get bogged down in the weeds. So now we have the transactions table set up. And we know we have the ability here to select the customers, choose the different items available, enter the quantity, then save that information. We notice that we have some additional fields now. All these virtual columns that we added, we don't want to show those either. So we're going to go back into the table and clean those up too. And we're going to use the same function here for the form, and we're just going to make sure that these are hidden. So when any form comes up, these aren't showing. And I do this method primarily because if I have to create more than one form for the same table, I don't have to sit there and manage multiple form settings if I don't need to. This is just a very simple way to start out and make sure that you're keeping things simple at the highest level possible in your app structure. And in this case, the highest level that we can control the visibility of our columns is in the column structure itself. So now we have the form. You can see those other columns have dropped off. And one other feature here too that I noticed when I click on users, I don't have an image associated with that. And maybe that would be helpful for the users itself. So I could come here to the units table and click on label for the unit, and you'll notice the images now show up when you're selecting those images. So then I could continue selecting that information and enter the appropriate quantity and then hit save. So with that, we have a method now to capture transactions from the customers. Now we need to move on to the next piece, which is to actually invoice those customers and how we can set up automations to not only create emails and attachments to those emails with the invoice, but also track to see when these invoices have been completed and been paid. So to get started, we're first going to create automation. And this automation we're going to call generate invoice. And this is something we're going to choose create a custom bot. This is something you can create on a set time schedule. So every month on the 1st, you generate a new invoice. But for the purposes of this example, we're actually going to generate an invoice when a new invoice record is created. So for the event, we're going to call it when new invoice is created. And you see AppSheet suggests new invoices record is created. So we'll just go ahead and use that because that's simpler. In addition to that, we're also going to run a process in response to that. And this process is going to be called generate invoice email and update transaction data, meaning that the goal of this process is going to not only send an email with the email attachment to the user, we're also going to update our transaction table to ensure that we annotate the invoice record that's associated with each of those transactions. That'll be important so we're not double counting transactions on invoices if we don't need to. It'll act as a step to prevent that from happening. Oop, and I got this in the wrong place. For the process, we want to call the process that, and then we want to we're going to have multiple steps in this process. So the first step is going to be update transaction data. And we're going to add another step here, and it's going to be generate email and invoice attachment. Okay, with those set as placeholders for the update transaction data table, we're going to run a data action. And this data action, we're going to create this new action, call this update invoice ID in transaction table, or more specifically, we'll call add invoice ID in transaction table. And this is where things might get a little tricky because we actually need two actions that need to run for this automation step. The first one is for AppSheet to run an action on a set of rows in that we identify what records from the transactions table we then copy the data to. So we're going to have to basically pass the invoice ID to the transactions table. And the first step is obviously going to be to identify the referenced rows. Those reference rows are going to be all the transactions that meet the criteria for that invoice. So if we generate an invoice for February of 2022 for a specific customer, then we need to make sure we have a list of all the transactions that match this criteria. So we're going to use a select statement to query this, and that we're going to go to the transactions table and we're going to pull a list of the transaction IDs for that table where these three values match. The first one being where the month of the date identified in the transactions table is equal to this row dot month, and that this is pulling from the current record and we're matching those values. And we'll do the same for the year. Then lastly, we'll ensure that the customer in the transaction table matches, and we'll go ahead and close that up. Now we have a list of transactions that'll be generated from this formula that match the settings, i.e. the month, the year, and the customer that has been set up in the invoice table. So the last part is the reference action that we need to set, and this hasn't been created yet. So what we can do is jump over to the action table. And for this, we're going to create an action called input invoice ID as an action. And that'll be associated with the transaction table specifically because that's what the values we want to update. And for the data, we're going to set the values of some columns in this row. And we're going to choose invoice. And then for the formula, we're going to use the input function. And this allows us to pass the variables or the values from one table to another. So we'll give this an arbitrary name, and we'll just call this invoice ID. And then for the second part, there's an initial value set. You could just set this to blank because we're not going to allow for any default values to be captured. And then we'll hit save on that. And then we're going to make sure, as always, when we create a new action, if we know it's part of an automation, we'll hide that. All right, so jumping back to our automation itself, now for the reference action, since we've created that action, we'll go ahead and select that action name as our reference action. And then we'll go ahead and hit save. So bear with us because we have this step that hasn't been fully filled out yet, so it's showing an error currently, but let's continue. Now that we've selected this reference action that we created, you'll notice that there's another input that shows up now. And this is where you can select that input name that we created in the action itself, and then we're going to select the ID from the invoice field that's been created. So now we have this value of the invoice ID that we're going to then carry over to the transaction table so we can populate that invoice ID in this transaction table here. So we'll know exactly what transactions have been logged to specific invoices. One thing we want to do with our transaction table is that with our invoice column, we want to also set that as a ref to our invoices table. And by doing this, this will also set up a virtual column so that every invoice has a list of transactions that are associated with it. Next, we also want to create an email with an invoice attachment here. So we're going to run a task for this, and then we're going to create a new task that's called send email with invoice attachment. And then for the table itself, we're going to use the invoice table, obviously. And then for the two, this is where you can select the customer that was selected because that's an email address that's associated with that field. And then for default content, we're going to disable this because we want to set up our own professional looking email. And then start to build out the subject here. And we could put in some references to the month and year. And then for the body, I'm just going to copy and paste the same thing. Obviously, you can do whatever you want with the body and communicate. Just know that when you're filling out these templates, anything in double arrows is inside of double arrows is an AppSheet formula. So in this case, very simple. I'm just pulling the column value itself from that record. But you can go as elaborate as you want, as I'll show you in the actual attachment template that we'll generate next. So we're going to scroll down here to attachment content type, and we want to generate a PDF for that. And then for attachment template, we're going to hit the create button. This is going to generate a Google Doc if you're using Google Docs, or a Microsoft Word doc if you're using other products that aren't Google-based products. So once that attachment template has been created, I can go ahead and click the view. Now that we open this template in Google Docs, you'll notice that AppSheet put together a template or PDF template automatically for you based off the values in the table itself. So this gives you a head start in configuring your invoice to give it your custom branding that you may need. So you could add images if you want to, or different colors. So it's an invoice from ABC Corp. And then we could, color this accordingly, or like I said, add images as part of that to get a layout we want. Just using these as a quick example here, but you'll come down here and you'll notice the different fields that have been called out as part of this invoice. And this is where you can, you obviously can customize this however you want. The text here that is not in any arrows are just free text. So you can either have these labels, or you can, you don't have to have these labels. And I won't belabor this, but I will call your attention to the bottom part. And this is where you have a list of your transactions, right? And this uses that start function where you can call your virtual column here, which is your, related transactions for that invoice. And then in that start, you have a list of all the transactions that'll be a part of that table. And then the way this is set up is this will loop through each transaction in the table and build this table out automatically. So you have a list of all your transactions in one place. So with our template set up, we can go back into the app sheet. Before I forget, we have one last thing we need to do, in that for the invoice itself, we need to have a total that gets populated. To do this, we're going to click on total, and for auto compute, we're going to choose the app formula. And this app formula will then contain all the related transactions with the total cost of that transaction. And then we're going to sum up those items to have a grand total for that invoice. One thing we want to do is, we also, after we add the transaction data, we also want to update the status as part of this process to pending payment. And this will also serve as a way to trigger the app formula that we mentioned for the total cost to update as well. We'll just call it set status to pending payment. And you'll see the AppSheet recommends that step as well and makes it easy to just select that and add that as a step to your app. And we'll go ahead and hit save. So with the app saved, we'll create a view for the invoice table. So with this invoice view, I can hit an add, and there's an invoice ID. I can choose the month that I'm looking to generate, along with the customer that I want to generate those items for. And then there's some items we need to clean up, but just to demonstrate the email piece and the automation piece we just set up, we can then save this. Now that it's generated, we see the invoice information that we created for the month and year. And then for related transactions, we see the two transactions that are associated with that month and year accordingly. And then if we were to jump into our email box, you'll see that we have this invoice that was populated, and in the attachment itself, we have our attachment here with the invoice information and the transaction information down below. Now, obviously, there's a lot of cleanup that needs to be done with all this, and I'm not going to belabor that because that's relatively simple at this point. In general, you can employ those methods that I showed you initially to clean up. One of the final things we can cover in this video is how to clean up this month and year, right? Year has a comma in it. That doesn't look right. So we can take care of that really quickly under invoices for the number and make sure we uncheck this thousands operator. And that went away. Now for month, it's a little bit trickier. The ideal solution for creating an invoice when you're generating an invoice is being able to select the month from a drop-down menu in conjunction with the year itself. So to do this, we're going to add another table to our app called months. And this is going to be a very simple table where all we're going to be doing here is have a month number and a month name. So we're going to go just do 1 through 12 and then month name, January, February, and we should be able to just drag this down and populate to December. So we could really quickly make this table and then add this to our application as a read-only table. And then in our invoice table under columns, we'll make month now as a reference and app sheet. Looks like it did that automatically for us. And in the months table itself, we're going to make sure that the name is the label, which AppSheet also smartly did that automatically itself. So now when we're creating an invoice, I now have the months available to choose from instead of numbers. And then likewise, I can pull that into my invoice as well, so that next to month, I can clean this up. And instead of month alone, we could do month dot month name as an example, and then include the year with a space in between. And maybe we'll bold that too. So now when I create a new invoice, the email I get makes more sense with the month and the date. So you see here, January of 2022. So with that, that concludes this video. Like I said, I didn't get down into the weeds on how to customize every little detail of this app. The main intent here is to show the concepts around how you would structure an app to deal with invoices. I'm going to go ahead and clean this app up after the video, and I will include this template in the comment section below under the video, so you can use that if you want to. As always, thanks everyone for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and also leave any questions in the comments below and I'll get back to you on those. Thanks everyone for watching, and have a good one.